Okay, now for today, we'll talk about technological change. And there are two things that we will talk about regarding technological change. Now, the first commentary will be on the S curve. Now, the S curve is a very popular model because it's supposed to give you or give everybody an idea on the trajectory of technological change. Okay, and you find out later on why does it take on the shape of an S curve. Why isn't it like a straight line, or why isn't it like a parabola or any other shape that you can think of, right? Or why isn't it like a circle? Okay, why is it S? And we'll go into the nuances or to the nature of the shape of the curve and why it's really looked like S. Now, typically, when you try to understand technological change, at the very least, you are looking at two dimensions. The first dimension, okay, so in the screen, you have the vertical axis. The first dimension is performance. So, how does that particular technology perform? Okay? The metric to be used can be anything. It can be speed, it can be accuracy, it can be, you know, like storage, it can be like throughput, it can be like amplitude, volume, anything of that sort, or scope. So the metric for performance can vary, but let's bundle all of them as performance. So that's your vertical or your y-axis. Now the other dimension to be considered is time. So if you think about it, when we talk about change, change is actually a function of time. Okay, there's really no change if time doesn't pass. Okay, so if you're stuck in that same time, then no change is going to happen, right? So necessarily when we look at changes, it has to be always with respect to time. So that's the other dimension, or in our diagram, that's going to be the horizontal or the x-axis. Now, if you go and take a look at at this, right? So at the start, you have, okay, towards the lower left portion. So a technology's performance evolves slowly in the beginning. So you can see that as time goes by, okay, the rate of improvement in performance is not that big. So it's like you're spending a lot of time, and yet the performance added in terms of improvements now is not comparable to the amount of time, okay, or even effort. You can even consider this dimension also as effort. It doesn't seem comparable. It's like slow, like it's like a slow gradual rise, okay. And why is that? Okay, well, uh, based on the experience of everybody when it comes to technology improving, okay, there are a lot of elements at play. Okay, generally, all of the improvements are not obvious. So you spend a lot of time perhaps working on something, but the improvements don't come immediately, and you're going to spend much more time than the improvements that you reap within that same period of time. So it takes a while. You're okay. So that's one. That's one factor why the growth of improvement is slow. Okay, at the start. Another factor is because at the beginning you're also learning about the technology. Okay, so there's this lag, so to speak, from a user standpoint, or from someone who tries to manipulate the technology. There's that lag, and that lag is about learning. So we'll talk more about learning later on, right? um, and that's why, um, when somebody tries to make use of that technology, it will probably be basic, so improvements in the technology won't happen immediately. So you have to let that person or that user or that manipulator learn the technology a bit, so that will take time. And then based on the learning that he or she has acquired, then improvements start to kick in. Then you get some ideas. Okay, I can probably improve it in this area, in that area, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's why it's slow at the very beginning. Now, at some point, a breakthrough happens. Okay, and now it improves rapidly. So Of course, I mean, the reason why it starts to improve is because now you're getting a hang of the technology. You have an idea of how it's going to work. Okay. And then now, because okay, you have some idea of how it's going to work, it's easier for you to actually implement improvements to that technology. It's getting faster and faster and faster and faster. At some point, a breakthrough would happen. Okay. And things start to really just skyrocket. Right. So every technology, at least the ones who will really get to survive the initial stages, they will actually skyrocket. They will go through that steep rise, so to speak. Okay. Now there are other technologies that because they evolve slowly in the beginning, unless the learning, unless the improvements accrue over time, eventually people will not be motivated to make use of that technology, and no improvements will be done through that technology. Eventually, it will just decline, right? So it's not even going to rise up; it will just go rise up, and then it plateaus or even drops. So nothing really happens with that technology. Okay, but even then, some people might argue, well, in that illustration where there might be a slow rise and then it drops immediately. If you take a magnifying glass and zoom at that trajectory, you're probably going to see an S curve somehow. Okay, but that's discussion for some other day, you know. But okay, ideally, technology improves over time. Okay, and then it immediately, okay, at some point in time, okay, improvement becomes rapid, it becomes steep. Now, as the technology rises rapidly, at some point in time, it will start to plateau. So this is what the upper right portion is saying. So the limits of what is scientifically possible are reached, and performance doesn't increase much more. Okay, now what's the reason why it plateaus? Well, from a feasibility point of view, um, there are limits. Some scholars would call this the diminishing returns. So there's a limit to how much resources you can put into the technology. That's one. There's so much learning that you can really extract from the existing technology. Maybe you've covered everything. There's nothing more to improve. Okay, and that's it. And of course, I mean, from a trade-off theory as well, this is not the only technology you're working on. There could be other things that you're working on. So, as a corollary to the lack of resources or to the limited number of resources, those resources that could have been used to improve the performance of this technology could have been moved to somewhere else. So, necessarily, it will have this experience of a plateau. Um, and let's take an example for watches. Now, so watches, so at the start, the first mechanical watches were thick as a lemon. Okay. So so maybe before that, so the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis would be, it says here, inches thick. It's inverted. But the idea here is that how portable your watch is. So that's the metric. Back then, they're thick as a lemon. They're huge, they're bulky. And then you can see that there has been some improvements over time. But then, at some point, it says here, since in the early 1900s, mechanical watches have not become much thinner. So there's really no way for you to make it thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. And that's the reality of physics, so to speak. If you really want to make things work, then there's a limit to what we can do. If you're going to look at it from our perspective in information technology, so how much smaller can you do your storage, right? Back in the old days, no, back in the old days, you probably have floppy disks that were sizable. I mean, the dimensions would be 5.25 inches, no? And the capacity for that was only 640 kilobytes. And that's now in our situation, 640K is like it's so small. I mean, it's probably negligible. You know, with a snap of a finger, you can actually download 640K very quickly. Okay, but back then it was this huge. Okay, and then you started to have possibilities for external drives. So the external drives are huge. I mean, you'd probably get back then you'd probably get around 128 gig, okay, and then 256. Now it's surprising that I have seen a USB drive that can store 1 terabyte. So just as small can actually store 1 terabyte, right? Or 8 times the 128 gig, no? So parang wow, I mean that's small, And just as an aside, it can be frustrating if you were thinking of buying an external drive, okay, maybe 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, and then all of a sudden you get to see somewhere posted in a website that it's only as small as a thumb drive now. Uh, it can be exasperating if you already bought your external drive. Okay. But that said, I mean, you can see that okay, there's as long as it's possible for us to keep on improving the limits or stretching the envelope as to what's possible with that technology, that's even possible. But notice that at the start it will be slow, and then the cadence starts to pick up, and then all of a sudden, boom! Okay, you're accelerating forward, and then at some point in time you're gonna hit a wall. Then things start to slow down, and things start to be a little bit pale. No? And as I said earlier, the description I'll give that it plateaus. So technology plateaus over time. Now you can look at this from the point of view of stages. So the S curve can have stages. So at the start, you call that your startup. Okay, so we're in improvements are slow. Okay, you're really doing startup. Okay, but there will come a point wherein things start to accelerate already. So that's your scale portion. Okay. Growth is possible. It's rapid. People will start leaving others behind. Okay, but then after the scale stage, there will come a point in time wherein, I'm not growing as fast as I used to, but I'm still growing. Okay, I'm still growing, but my rate of growth is not that fast. So we reach a stage wherein we go into the compete, because now everybody else can catch up with you. Okay, and then there will be more and more people trying to compete for attention, for market space, and it can be a little bit tough during the scale stage, because growth is really rapid. So there's really room for everyone. You're not really concerned about your place in the world, right? But like all physical realities, there's going to be that time where things slow down, and then you start to compete with everybody else. And then until finally, the last stage is that it will plateau. Okay? That point of plateau is what you call a transition stage. Why? Why is it transition? Because after the transition, okay, well, not really after the transition, but as you're going through the transition stage, you will be faced with a question that you have to answer. Would you want to keep this technology, or you want to move to somewhere else? Now, if you let the technology run its course, as they say, and if you can see the red dotted lines towards the tail end of the S curve, okay, other scholars would call this the decline stage. Eventually, the technology will no longer be used. Okay? People will start to unload a lot of the things about this technology. They'll start to not use it anymore. Okay? And worse is that the so-called improvements that have been accrued by this technology are no longer improvements. Okay? People will not appreciate the improvements that this technology has gained over a period of time, over a long period of time. So if you decide to stay with that technology, you will go through that stage called the decline stage. So eventually you'll have to decline. No? And if you're a company and you are experiencing a decline stage, your option really is to just simply unload the assets, not sell everything, and then you try to recover as much monetary value as you can from the physical assets, but or from other assets as well. No? I mean, we'll talk about protection later on when we deal with intellectual property. So these are also considered assets. But even then, at that level, at that stage, I mean, if it's already at the decline stage, will your intellectual property be worth anything, right, when you sell it? Because it's probably not going to be worth anything if it's on a decline. But anyway, so these are your stages. Okay, so the compete and the transition stage, these are normally the maturity stages or the mature stages. Um, you're starting to get that feel that there's not a lot of things that you can do with the technology further. Now, as the technology reaches its mature stage, it becomes increasingly vulnerable to substitute technologies. Yeah, you can probably look at this from the perspective that other technologies can be your competitor. So, technology A, if you're dealing with technology A, and there are other substitute technologies, technology B, technology C, you might look at look at these technologies as competitors, but they're actually not, right? You could view them as partners because at some point in time, you make a decision to move into either of those technologies, especially if they're on their way up. Okay? So and this is what happens with substitute technologies. Okay, sometimes as they start, the initially lower performance make it seemingly irrational for firms dominating in the previous technology to invest at an early point. So technology A is the dominant technology and technology B is the upstart. So at that period in time, okay, maybe the performance of technology B compared to technology A using the same metric of performance, technology B is worse. Right? Typical of new technologies, you're starting to learn, you're getting a lot of resources, yeah, and performance is not quick in coming. But at some point in time, and this has been noticed by a lot of scholars, by a lot of people working with technology, is that eventually this technology B, will follow the same trajectory as all the other technologies. So it will follow an S curve. So at that time, when technology A starts to mature and go through the transition stage and eventually going to decline, it is at that time that technology B is actually rising up very quickly. So much so that there will come a point in time that the performance of technology B will be much better than the performance of technology A. Okay? And that happens. Okay? That happens. So some of the corollary questions that you might have is why is it that technology B was considered by the company? Why did they stick it out to technology A, right? Why didn't they make any investments in technology B? Well, if you look at it from this chart, it seems like we have perfect vision of the future, right? But in reality, you don't really know what's going to happen. Okay? What you do know, and this is something that we were talking about technology management as a science, right? What we do know is that technologies follow an S curve. So at some point in time, you know that the technology will mature. You know that the technology will decline. You just don't know yet, or you might have an idea, but you're not 100% sure on where you are on that S curve. Diba? For sure, for new technologies, you're at the start. Malinaw yon. But uh, but as you go up, no, as time goes by, the question that you ask yourself, well, am I still in the startup, or am I already scaling, or am I maturing? Okay, I mean, what's difficult is that you don't know. This is usually the case. People don't know whether they're still scaling up or they're actually starting to plateau and slow down, and that's why things get to be more competitive. And that's difficult because the nature of the decisions of your managers, okay, with scale is different with the decisions that you'll take when you're competing, okay, when things are saturated or mature. Okay. Naturally, when you have an idea that the technology is maturing, then it gives you an idea, okay, I need to start be looking out on substitute technologies that can outpace the current technology I'm in. So that's one thing that you have to be very, very clear about as well, right? You get to see that, okay, performance, okay, starts to slow down a bit in terms of rate of growth, no, and then you have that feeling, okay, I might be in the maturity stage already. So that's one thing that this would be a good tip for most of you dealing with technology. You know, you have to ask yourself: is my technology right now at that stage wherein it's still going to improve much better, or is it going to be at that stage where okay, it's really slowing down? Other technologies might replace it in the future. Okay, so here's a sample on the mechanical calculators. No? So back in the 1950s, no, so your calculators would look this clunky, you know. In fact, you can think of computers. No, computers would occupy single rooms, and their total storage would be like 5 megabytes lang, okay, 5 meg, you know, and they would occupy a whole room, right? But you know, mechanical calculators were also bulky at the start, okay? And then eventually, mechanical calculators had reached a technological maturity. But then around that period, as it's reaching maturity, electronic calculators were started to be developed. Okay, but because of the initial capital outlay, okay, they're more expensive. They don't really promise better performance off the bat. Okay, and then there will be improvements in the electronics technology, and then eventually to has already outpaced mechanical calculators. You don't see that anymore. The market. I don't know if some of you had experience working with a slide rule, but that those were the scientific calculators back in the day, right? So, so a lot of the engineers are very good, you know, using the slide rule. But nowadays, just pick up a scientific calculator. Heck, just pick up a smartphone. It already has a scientific calculator function there. So it's pretty much how we are right now when it comes to technology. So those are the sketches on the S curve. I mean, there are a lot of material on how it's being tackled. There are many representations and interpretations of the S curve, but I'm sure you'll pick up some of the key ideas with the S curve. Okay, one is technology follows a predictable pattern of growth. Okay, slow at the start, okay, and then goes rapid, and then slows down again. Okay, and there are reasons why they happen that way. Okay, number two, you don't really know exactly where you are on the S curve, but you do know that it will follow the S curve. Okay? And because of that, there's a corollary to that. Okay? Other technologies will slowly supplant these existing technologies, okay, which would also follow the same S curve behavior. So, uh, at the very least, you know that they follow that type of behavior, and therefore that's pretty much how it is with the S curve. Okay, question so far on the S curve. Okay, if there's none, I will